With chapter 11, we enter a new section of Mark. Jesus, for the first time, comes to Jerusalem. Looking at the Gospel of Mark, you can divide it into three parts. The first part, chapters 1 through the middle of chapter 8, these chapters take place in and around Galilee. Here we learn about Jesus and his mission. The second part is the journey to Jerusalem, during which we learn about the way of the cross. And then with chapter 11, we get to the third section. This section takes place in the city of Jerusalem and speaks about everything that leads up to Jesus' death and resurrection. So Jerusalem, that's where we find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 11, or more specifically, we find ourselves right outside of Jerusalem. Jesus is about to enter the city. Now we know, because we read this last week, that the disciples are afraid to enter Jerusalem. Up until this point in Mark's Gospel, Jerusalem has been portrayed negatively. It's the place where Israel's Messiah, Jesus, will be rejected by the leaders and will be killed. So the disciples, they're fearful as they approach the city. And yet while Mark's portrayal of Jerusalem so far has been consistently negative, there is another aspect to Jerusalem. It is the city of David, the capital of the nation. It's the site of the temple, the visible focus of the worship of Israel's God. And it's for these reasons why the Messiah must come to his capital and present himself to his people. And that's what Jesus comes to do. Chapter 11 begins with Jesus throwing down the gauntlet. Jesus, he enters the city in the period leading up to the Passover festival. A large number of pilgrims would have been coming into Jerusalem at this time. So it would have been possible and easy for Jesus and his disciples to enter Jerusalem quietly. But that's not what Jesus does. Instead, Jesus performs two acts that force a confrontation with the religious authorities. The first act is staging a royal procession into Jerusalem. It's pretty clear that Jesus knew what he was doing as he processed into the city. One commentator says that when Jesus rides a donkey into the city, and when he has the people shout, "Hosanna, Son of David," what he's doing is he's engaging in a kind of choreographed street theater. He's acting out Zechariah's prophecy of a king who comes into Jerusalem riding a donkey. He's making a messianic claim with this entry. That's the first act. The second act of throwing down the gauntlet is when Jesus cleanses the temple. Jesus walks into the temple and he overthrows the tables of the money changers and those selling doves for sacrifice. Mark also adds that Jesus prohibits the carrying of merchandise or vessels through the temple. This is an act of protest, but it's also a claim of authority. Jesus is claiming authority over the temple. He decides what happens there. These are bold claims, bold actions, and they force a response. Now, interwoven into this second act of cleansing the temple is a rather curious and I think confusing incident. This is the withering of the fig tree. Commentators and scholars have wrestled with the details of this event. To some, Jesus' curse of the fig tree, when he finds it with no figs, seems spontaneous and spiteful, especially given that Mark goes out of his way to tell us that it was not the time of year to expect figs. There are lots of theories about this, such as Jesus would have been able to see the beginning buds that would become figs. Honestly, I wouldn't spend much time on this question in your group, You can come to the church library later and read lots of commentaries on these theories. What is clear, and what you should think about this week, is this: Jesus is offering an acted out parable. The fig tree represents the temple. Lots of leaves, but no fruit. The temple, this parable says, is barren. A lot of pomp and circumstance, but the worship there is self-serving. Again, lots of leaves, but no fruit. This connection is clear when you look at the structure of the narrative. Jesus first visits the temple, then he goes out and curses the fig tree, goes back to the temple and cleanses it. He goes back to the fig tree, it's found to be dead, then he returns to the temple. Again, the message is clear. The temple is barren, all leaves, no fruit. Sometimes religious practice can be barren. I'm sure you've encountered this, maybe even in your own life at times. One thing to reflect on as you discuss this section is, why does Jesus talk about prayer when the fig tree is discovered dead? This is Mark's only collection of Jesus' teaching on prayer. He says that we as his disciples are to be men and women of prayer. If this acted out parable is saying that the temple no longer serves as a house of prayer, this description of the disciples as a praying community, it might lead us to reflect on where the true focus of God's people is now to be found. Towards the end of chapter 11, starting at verse 27 and through the rest of chapter 12, Jesus confronts the Jerusalem establishment. All this takes place back at the temple. In this symbolic area, they spar over matters of religious and political interest, but particularly in reference to Jesus' role and authority. The sense of alienation between Jesus and those who control the temple, it continues to grow in this section until Jesus publicly denounces the insincerity and perverted values of the scribes. Chapter 12, it ends with the powerful story of the widow sacrificing all that she has. It's a little picture of what true faith and trust in God looks like. Reflect on the widow and her actions. After this story, Jesus leaves the temple, never to return again.